unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. It seems like you cannot open up a newspaper, listen to a foreign policy podcast, or open up Twitter without somebody somewhere sounding off on the emerging geopolitical battle over semiconductors. Semiconductors, which we colloquially refer to as chips, have moved from the periphery to center stage of global high politics. A new book by Pranay and Abhiram Manchi, When the Chips Are Down, a deep dive into a global crisis, could not have arrived at a more opportune time. The book is a terrific guide to those who want to understand the importance of semiconductors at this geopolitical crossroads. It provides a history of the technology, but also offers us a forward-looking analysis of how the world will balance national security interests with rapid technological change. Pranay is chair of high-tech geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution in Bangalore. Before joining the institute, he worked as a chip design engineer in 2 Fortune 500 semiconductor companies. Pranay joined us on the show last year to talk about his book, Missing in Action, Why You Should Care About Public Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome him back to the show today. Pranay, thanks for joining and congrats on the book.
Thanks so much, Milan. And what you said in the introduction, right, it was true even for the technology realm. Like 10 years ago, no one in technology even considered semiconductors technology because so much was the dominance of software. So no one cared about these commodified chips, which you just get it from somewhere, didn't matter. But such has been the change that everyone's talking about it now.
Well, you were ahead of your time because you worked at 2 semiconductor companies, so you clearly knew what the deal is. I want to start this conversation, Pranay, at like a very, very basic level, because I think a lot of people like me encounter this terminology. We read stories in places like the New York Times or The Economist about the race for semiconductor dominance. But again, speaking for myself, don't really understand the specifics of what we're talking about. We don't have a technical understanding of this domain at all. So let's just start with like a very big question, which is, what are semiconductors and what are they used for?
Right. So semiconductors, as the name suggests, it refers to a certain material where the conductivity, the electrical conductivity, is somewhere between an insulator and a conductor, right? So a conductor is where the electrons flow way too fast, so you cannot control them, and hence it's useless for our purposes. Similarly, the insulator is where the movement of electrons is too slow, and again, you can't move the electrons from one place to the other, so it is not useful. So semiconductors are in that sweet spot where you can actually control the flow of electrons from one part to the other. Now, this is really foundational, and hence semiconductors underlie all our modern electronics and computers and what have you, right? Even cars have many, many semiconductors in them. Right. So now going one level higher, a specific arrangement of a treated semiconductor material can be made into a basic unit, which we call as the transistor. And transistor is where you can control the flow of electrons in one part of the circuit, and you can achieve a change in the current or voltage or any other kind of energy in another part of the circuit. Now, this seems quite quotidian, but it is actually something very, very big. Basically, it can act as a switch because you can control the flow of current in another part of the circuit by the current flowing in another part of the circuit, right? So this is a superpower. You can use groups of transistors to amplify current. You can use it to store value. You can use it to produce signals, to produce light like you would see in LED bulbs, etc., right? So this tunable nature of semiconductors actually makes them useful for converting or controlling energy across different domains. Just take an example of an LED. electricity flows in one part of the circuit using a transistor, and this transistor is made up of materials which, when triggered in a particular way, will release photons which give us light, right? So this is one simple example in which you're using electricity and converting it into light using something called a transistor. So this is a basic of semiconductors, and there's a lot of physics, etc., and chemistry which all combine together. But I can say that transistor probably is perhaps the greatest invention over the last 100 years, which has made all of these things possible. Now, so we start with the transistor, but what we call colloquially is chips, right? So when you combine many of these transistors, like millions and millions of them, you can achieve very complex functionalities. So just to give you an example of the scale, if you have an Apple phone, the processor chip, which is the central brain of that phone, that will have 134 million transistors in per millimeter square of area, right? So that's the kind of density which is there inside it, and because of these transistors you can achieve a lot of functionality that you want. And this is the starting point. And ICs began in 1950s. Until then, you used to have these transistors which were made manually, which were designed manually, their connections were made manually, and this was not a process which could be scaled up. Imagine if you have to do this for 134 million transistors on per millimeter square. But over time there were many technological advancements, something called the planar process, etc., which made this process highly automated, highly reliable, and hence you could achieve this massive packing of transistors at a miniaturized scale, and hence you have these wonders that we take for granted today.
I mean, that was beautifully explained, Pranay. I wish that we had had this conversation a couple of years ago. Would have made me understand the situation we're in a much better. The book goes over what you call the sort of four pillars or the four elements of the semiconductor supply chain, right? So you have materials, you have design, you have manufacturing, and then you have something called assembly, test, and packaging. And in the book, you explore each of these four components by illustrating how an iPhone processor chip is made. And I think, most of us have an iPhone or an Android or something, similar. Maybe you could just kind of walk our listeners through these four stages, using the sort of phone as an illustration.
Yeah. So, as you said, these are like really stylized four stages. The actual process is far more complicated, but for our purposes, we'll just understand the more core elements of this, right? So let's say you have an Apple iPhone and you want to make the processors, right? So someone in the Apple team will decide that you need to have a camera of this specification, this latency, and it should be this powerful, so on and so forth. Now finally, to achieve that functionality, you need to make hardware that can achieve that kind of processing speed, power, etc. So to do that, first stage that we generally talk about is the design stage. So in the design stage, what a person will do is they will go, and it's literally like building a city, just like an architect builds a city. Someone will actually plan out that the camera module should be on this part of the chip and the processor module should be on that part of the chip. This is how the power lines will be laid. These are where the drains will be laid, right? So all that process happens in the design stage, where you're literally planning these things out. So you can imagine you're literally planning what those 134 million transistors, how they are going to be placed. And this obviously you can't do it manually. So there are software tools which help you to do that. They are called electronic design automation tools. But these are softwares which help people do this. So this stage is called the semiconductor design stage. It is a very human capital intensive stage. You need a large engineering team to be able to convert something that you want as a functionality for an Apple phone into these hardware blocks which will end up achieving this functionality. So the output of the design stage is finally just a set of electronic files which are literally telling a person where these components are placed and what is the type of connection between them and so on and so forth. So you can imagine a very big file which just tells you that. Now the next stage is where you actually realize this imaginary thing onto something physical. So that's what is called the manufacturing stage. And this, as you can imagine, it is a highly capital intensive stage because you literally have to carve out all these things on at a very very miniaturized scale, right? So now we are talk about 5 nanometers or 3 nanometers, so that roughly indicates the smallest feature size. So I mean, human hair is way way thicker than that, right? And we are literally talking about a few atoms apart, and that's the pitch at which you need to etch out things on a material. So to achieve this functionality, you need purity levels, purity environments of really insane degrees. You need specialized suits for people who go into these environments. You need specialized gases, etc. So all that comes into the materials part, and all of this is happens on a semiconductor, which is generally silicon. Sometimes other semiconductors are also used, but most commonly it is silicon. So that's why the materials part comes in. You need to be able to produce this silicon ingot and you need to cut it in a specific way, and you need to ensure that there are no impurities. Imagine if a hair falls on it, you might actually short the circuit and it might not be functional, right? So you need to achieve, you can't even have a dust particle in. So semiconductor manufacturing environments are some of the purest environments in ever made possible by human design, right? There's nothing more pure than that. So you need to achieve that kind of functionality. And so once you have that material, you will etch out that design using the files that the design stage has given. And in the manufacturing stage, you do this using very specialized machines. And that's why it is very costly. The TSMC fab in Arizona, for example, which has just started, it cost a whopping $12 billion just to start up, right? That's the kind of cost you require. Once that is done, you have a big waffle-sized disk on which there are chips, dies, which we call, and these functionalities are achieved on that. Next stage is to actually cut this waffle, and all the squares on a waffle you need to package them. So that is what is called the assembly, test and packaging stage, where you cut this disk into smaller chips and you test them and you package them. So if you see any phone inside, you will have that black colored IC, right? Black IC, which is finally a packaged version. You in order to prevent electrostatic currents flowing into it, etc., you make it safe by packaging it. So that's the third stage, and this is a labor intensive stage. So you do need capital, but you need a large amount of people to be able to get this thing done. It might not be very high skilled labor, but you need both skilled and semi skilled labor at this stage. So these are sort of the broad things. The output is finally that black square IC, which you see, it's ubiquitous, whether it's in your TV or in your washing machine or dishwasher.
Pranay, I want to just ask you a little bit about the moment that we're in today. As we record at the start of 2024, chips have now been caught up in this larger swirl of geopolitical considerations, right? I mean, it's not for nothing that one of the most widely read books of 2023 was a book called Chip Wars by the scholar Chris Miller. I must have read a ton of year-end kind of best of lists, right? Particularly by people in the policy world. And this one was like on every list. Tell us a little bit, again, just kind of at a macro level, what are some of the underlying geopolitical factors that are fueling this present race that we're experiencing, this race for dominance in the semiconductor space?
Yeah. Actually, before I say that, I think the word race that you used, or a contestation, is a better framing, according to me, than a war, because this is not a war in the sense that there is no there won't be one victor or the other. And from an American perspective, I think the war framing has a lot to do with aligning domestic vectors to get some things done at home. So just like there have been wars on drugs and wars on many other
Poverty.
things. Yeah, war on poverty. This is another that kind of war. So it's not necessarily something which is a zero sum game between US and China, and because the entire supply chain is so diversified and globalized. So with that out of the way, the reason why I think today is when we are talking about semiconductors in I call semiconductors as metacritical, not just critical, because there are three different kinds of reasons which have converged at this moment to make semiconductors an important thing and that everyone is talking about. So the three reasons are: one is geopolitical, second one is geoeconomic, and the third one is technological. I'll go through each of them. So the geopolitical reason is, of course, one, the four stages that we talked about. In that, the most crucial stage is manufacturing, given the huge capital investment required. Now, the way the industry has evolved, that Taiwan is a crucial node for advanced semiconductors. So whether it is the advanced semiconductors for F-35 aircraft or whether it is for your iPhone, it would be made in TSMC in Taiwan. Now, given China-Taiwan relations worsening, there is a fear that if China were to, invade Taiwan, or even if not invade, if there's a blockade of Taiwan, what would be the repercussions of that on the wider world is a geopolitical concern motivating a lot of these actions. The second geopolitical reason is just US-China relations, right? Now, given what that relationship is going through, there is again an idea that how can US get ahead of China? And obviously, big nuclear weapons make big conventional conflict unlikely. Similarly, the economic interdependence is so much that you can't even have a huge economic decoupling. So technology is one sector where the contestation is going on. And within this technological contestations, chips are one place where China's technology stack is quite weak actually compared to what it is doing in other spaces. So US probably chose this domain as a domain to counter China because it is dominant whereas China is weak, right? So the rule of strategy being you attack an adversary in a domain where they are weak, right? So that's sort of the geopolitical side of it. The second angle is geoeconomic. Now, that was brought to the fore due to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So you had this situation where you actually chips were available, and then because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the people who used to place orders at these manufacturing firms just stopped placing orders, like the automobile firms largely. And when the demand again picked up, these automobile firms couldn't find any slots from these manufacturing players because all of us were on Zoom, all of us were on computers. So the demand slots for manufacturing were picked up by the producers of laptops, computers, data centers, and so on and so forth. So automobile firms realized that, hey, we need to do something such that this doesn't happen again. So, and it's not just this, because this industry has evolved in such a way where there's comparative advantage based specialization. No one country does everything. Every segment, every country has a few companies which have some play in one short segment of that supply chain, and they are really, really good at it, but they are also interdependent on other components. Now, this is great from an economic efficiency point of view, but there are also costs of resilience, and those things were brought to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic. And many companies started wondering that if there's another COVID-19 pandemic, if there is an earthquake in Japan, or if there is a drought in Taiwan, all these are realistic scenarios. What happens to the industry? So can we at least try to address this, not from a geopolitical lens, but from an economic lens? Can we become more resilient? So that was the second reason. And the third reason is technological, because whenever we are talking about AI or we are talking about 6G or what have you, all of those are the underlying technology behind all of them is advanced semiconductors and new architectures. So, for example, on AI chips, we're talking about GPUs, which are made by NVIDIA today, but there might be other architectures which might come up. So, if you want to get advanced in any of the other technological domains, you also need to care about what happens on the semiconductors front. So, these are three things which converged during the last 2-3 years, and hence we are talking about it a lot more.
Pranay, I just want to kind of go back to something that you mentioned at the start, because I think it's really important to kind of understand how this is all playing out. We hear a lot about one Taiwanese firm in particular, TSMC. It almost has this kind of mythical status among people who sort of, follow this domain. Could you just briefly explain to us why this firm in particular became so essential? What it is that they do that is unlike what every other company in this sector has been able to achieve?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just again go back to the four-fold classification that we said, right? Materials and design, manufacturing, and assembly. So TSMC falls under that manufacturing bucket. So it does manufacturing only. Okay. So earlier, when there used to be an ICs with just 64 transistors in them, all of this could be done by one single company. So Intel could do everything, all of the 4 stages in-house. But as the costs kept rising and you had to do all of this, then capital costs, as I said, kept rising. You need $12 billion. How many companies can invest that, right? So what happened was this wonderful economic innovation as well, which just said that, people in Taiwan went and said that you don't need, whether you're AMD or you're NVIDIA, don't worry about the manufacturing part. We'll take care of that for you. So you only worry about producing great design and give us the files, and we will finally produce the physical IC for you, right? So this is called some pure play semiconductor foundry. So this is a model which was invented by TSMC. Before that, it was all integrated into one single company. So now this was a big economic innovation. It really took out the problems that a small startup would have, right? Imagine if you are a startup, you want to make a new chip and you have to invest $12 billion in making a new foundry. You are not going to ever begin to do anything. So TSMC said, you folks don't worry, we will perfect the art of making these chips in physical reality. So they don't do any design, they don't have any intellectual property on the design side, So for example, when Apple makes the chips, it doesn't say made in TSMC or it's not advertised. It was just that we are knowing about it because of the geopolitical realities. So this is how TSMC became, and this was a new model, and it really took off because and it elevated the costs that all these design firms had. Second, TSMC pours massive R&D funding into keeping their manufacturing processes and facilities at the cutting edge. So for example, they've just committed around $30 billion in R&D investments a couple of years ago. So that's the kind of scale you're talking about, right? The third one is they have a track record of innovation. All of this is finally a recipe. You need to be able to make maximum number of chips in minimum number of time with minimum failures. So it's a recipe which they have perfected. There are other companies which have done that, but this company has done it better than anyone else. And final reason is they are very good at working with other global players. Like I said, manufacturing is just one component. You still need materials from Japan. You need specialized gases from Japan. You need the machine which actually does the etching from Netherlands. The company is called ASML. So you need to have a culture which can work with many different global players and still produce the best. And again, TSMC has been able to do that by working with very diverse players across the globe. So that's the reason why it is the linchpin of this industry today.
It's very, very, very useful. And and actually links to what I wanted to ask about next, which is, one of the things you point out in the book is that high technology domains, whether it's AI or chips, are increasingly finding a place in various national security conversations we're having around the world. But what I also learned from your book is that this nexus between national security, technological dominance is not necessarily new, right? You have an example in your book. You talk about how President Ronald Reagan, way back in the 1980s, slapped tariffs on Japan in order to boost the American semiconductor industry as it was back then. So the so-called chip wars, or race for chip dominance to be more accurate, how new are they really? Is just kind of like a different episode of a series that we've seen before?
Yeah, it is a different episode of a series, but this is a blockbuster episode, so you can think of it that way. Because earlier, there was a contestation during the Cold War period also, and in fact, USSR tried a lot to copy what was happening in the Silicon Valley. They had their own silicon city called Zelenograd, which didn't take off. There was a contestation at that time. The second was between US and Japan, when Japan really became the dominant supplier of memory chips, and again this was a big threat to the US dominance, and then it was resolved. But the change was that US and Japan were treaty allies, right? So they were able to resolve things amicably, sort of, and both of them agreed. So Japan and US agreed that there will be some sort of compromise such that both industries can go on together. That is no longer the case today, right? So US and China are really contesting. There is very little possibility of this kind of compromise which could happen with US and Japan. So that's one reason. The second difference is that we are today talking about a very broad range of technologies. It's not just about memory chips as it was the case in US Japan situation. We are also talking about leading edge processors, equipment, material, even the software which I said about which is used now for making chips. That is also geopoliticized, right? There is contest over that as well. Packaging even. So all this is much broader than it was earlier. The third one is just industrial policy and subsidies are a lot more today, and US sees that as an existential threat given what China is doing, maybe underpricing, etc. So that is the third reason. And fourth, the industry is much more globalized today than it was earlier. So earlier you could think of US semiconductor industry, meaning that everything could happen in the US, and you could have an alternate product which everything could be done in Japan, and those two weren't talking to each other. But today that's not possible, and anything which happens between US and China or on this front impacts the rest of the world. So that is also a significant difference today.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So this leads nicely to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is about the role of the United States. So I want to ask you how they've approached this moment. When Donald Trump was president, which was not so long ago, his administration took a series of steps that you write in the book set back China's semiconductor industry by 10 to 15 years, by your guess. Tell us a little bit about what his administration did and why were the impacts so deeply felt in China?
Yeah. So I don't think it's just Trump's attempts, but it is also President Trump and President Biden's attempts. Both combined have set China back by a decade is what we estimate. That they can close the gap, but at this stage we feel they have set them back. So what happened during first President Trump's time was that in May 2019, the Commerce Department blacklisted Huawei and 70 of its affiliates, barring American firms from selling them certain technologies without government approval. So that was the first stage. And this sort of shed light on another bottleneck, which was chips. And hence there were again some export control orders specifically on Huawei and ZTE, which was another Chinese firm. So this was the first time when you realize that chips can be used as a geopolitical instrument in this particular contestation, right? So what they said is Huawei was trying to really progress and make the most advanced chips, and those advanced chips also have dual use cases, right? So they can be used in military or AI, military decision making, etc. So what this did was that it sort of stopped Huawei from first able to access the American market and also to access the chips which are really required to make some of these equipment. So that was the first step. And once the US saw that there is some success in this method, the Biden administration doubled down on it, right? So that was sort of the next step, where it was formalized into a proper export control. There were rules put in place and all that. So that happened subsequently. This is the way it started in 2019, and then the Biden administration continued with it.
So that's a nice transition to asking about this administration, which is in power in Washington today. It seems like they came in and did two things. One set of actions that were kind of negative, continuing what Trump did, and the other that were positive. So on the negative side, it took additional steps to further restrict China's tech advantage, right? They came up with this tagline, right, of having a small yard with a high fence, right, to indicate that there would be a certain set of technologies that they would like to restrict in order to not give due advantage to geopolitical rivals, and by turn giving us Americans an advantage. But on the positive side, the Biden administration did something else, of course, with the help of the Congress, which was to pass the CHIPS and Science Act, which pumped in $52 billion into domestic chip manufacturing in the United States. Tell us a little bit about the positive side. You know, how much of a game changer do you think that piece of legislation actually was?
Right. So, as I said, right, so the chip war, again, the central point of that was this, right? So can you get domestic vectors aligned so that you are pushing and becoming more competitive? So Chips and Science Act is the central node of that strategy, right? So that came first. That came on August 9, 2022. And then the export controls came on October 7th, 2022, right? So the first part was to re-energize the American semiconductor industry. And remember, there were a lot of companies. For example, Intel has made a lot of investment in China. It also was invested into, it had fabs there, manufacturing facilities. It also was investing into cutting edge design firms there. So a lot of these semiconductor companies were going back and telling to the US government that if you want us to stay in the US, you better give us something in return. Otherwise, there are other options in other places. So this Chips and Science Act had been brewing for quite some time, at least 2 years. I have seen this being talked about. Finally, it passed in August 9, where the idea is to support the advanced semiconductor design part, advanced semiconductor manufacturing part, and also some part of the trailing semiconductor part, the old chips which are not so strategic, but still you want to develop things there. So a bunch of things are being done under the Chips and Science Act. There is also a new center, National Semiconductor Technology Center, which is being developed. So the focus of all that is to identify what will be the semiconductor technology 5, 7, 8 years from now, and decide whether the US can take a lead in that or not. So it goes all the way across all the four things we talked about, materials, design, manufacturing, packaging, also the software which goes into that. For example, DARPA has a project to identify open source alternatives which can really quicken the pace of the design process. Also, there are concerns that there are some, can there be hardware espionage? So is China bugging the chips or bugging the boards on which chip rests? So there is an electronic resurgence initiative by the DARPA to again see whether you have hardware security built in and such espionage attempts can be detected. So all these are sort of coming together in the chips and science act.
I want to bring India into this conversation. At the end of the day, this is still a podcast about Indian politics and Indian public policy. In the book, you recount 3 attempts by India to try and build a domestic semiconductor industry. And before we get into version 3.0, which is the Modi government's kind of latest attempt, take us back and help us understand the previous 2 efforts. What did the government seek to do? And why is it that you and your co-author think that they failed?
Right. So first of all, India is a very big node of the semiconductor supply chain. Me being one of the examples, like there are 20%, the government estimates that 20% of the design engineers of the world are in India. So most of them are working for MNCs, American firms or Taiwanese firms. So there is very little Indian intellectual property, but a lot of Indian talent which is designing chips for the world. So there are many estimates that almost 9 out of 10 chips which are made across the world, there will be some Indian part or design work which would have happened in the process.
But and this doesn't even include presumably Indian engineers who are living in places like Silicon Valley or other places who are involved, right?
Yeah, I haven't even included. So this, I'm purely including just the people who are based out of India.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of involvement. So India in the design segment, which is the human capital intensive stage, is been doing well. In fact, the first MNC to set up shop in Bangalore was a semiconductor company, not a software company, right? Texas Instruments in '85. So that's that's one segment where India has a role and it is a crucial node. But where India has failed is in the manufacturing and assembly segment. That is where you have no presence. There are 0 commercial manufacturing facilities for chips in India. So that's what we were trying to address, why India has failed there. And what we found is, we tried to sort of divide India's many experiments on this into 3 phases. So the first phase was what we call by the government and for the government. So this was the pre-1991 era, Milan, which you very well know how the situation was. There were 2 government firms which were only licensed to make these chips. And because they were government firms, competition for government firms was anathema, right? Like, how can 2 firms make the same thing? It was seen as wastage. So eventually the government said that no, only one of these firms should make chips. The other was restricted to doing the integration and higher electronics assembly. And that firm, again, you see a familiar situation there, that because they are government firms, as costs kept rising of manufacturing, you needed to keep pumping in money constantly. And the only way you can recoup that investment is when you are manufacturing globally, mass scale, for so that you can produce a lot of revenue, right? But when you're a government firm, why would you export? What's the incentive? So these government firms just restricted themselves to satisfying the needs of the space or the defense sector, which were small players. Their demands were not high. So they were able to reliably provide for them, but nothing nothing in the commercial segment, right? Also, there were huge import restrictions because, as you know, foreign exchange was a very precious commodity back then. So because of limited foreign exchange, these companies couldn't import a lot of equipment. So even though they started almost at the same level as Taiwan, and in fact, they also got technology transfer from some US firms, which were the same US firms that gave technology transfers to Taiwanese companies. So the starting points are pretty similar, but because of the way the public policy environment was back then, these firms couldn't go ahead and they sort of just fell away. And by the late 1980s, the gap really widened between the Taiwanese firms and the Indian firms. So that was one phase. The second phase is what we call the phase, we call it the unease of doing business, right? So that is where you have this stage, roughly from the 2000s and 2005, etc. Again, the talk started that we need to do something in manufacturing, and that was also the golden period for India's growth, right? 2002 to 2007. So there were many attempts made during that period also to start off new firms. There was one fab city which was supposed to be planned in Hyderabad again in 2006. Some of the AMD was one company which was involved in this. So there was again an energy. Also, there was Chandrababu Naidu at that time, wanted to get this done in Hyderabad, etc. So they wanted to start an assembly plant. But again, by the time 2008 happened, and after 2008, AMD also changed its business model. So it fell up by the side. There were another two attempts made in 2014. Similar story. In some investors are initially interested, they promise some money, big investments are made, but then they fell by after some time. In 2015, again a US firm called Cricket Semiconductors announced a plan to make a fab in Madhya Pradesh, and again that fell down. So what the common thread in the second phase is, what you see is there were into 2012, as you know, there was this huge Vodafone retrospective taxation case. So that's just an illustration which told people and spooked the investors, because these chip fab, if you want to start the manufacturing facility today, the first chip will be produced 3-4 years down the line. That's the scale it requires to just build this. So no investor is going to put money when the policy environment is uncertain, when the tax environment is uncertain, when the trade environment is uncertain. So this was the phase where we were going through that churn where all three were a bit shaky, and hence none of the big investors who could have invested came by. So that is how I would summarize the second stage.
So now we come to the third stage, version 3.0. And, India, like many other countries, the United States, Europe, and others, realizes that once again, it has to step up its game, particularly in light of the COVID-19 experience, worsening relations with China, many of the geopolitical, geoeconomic, and technological factors you alluded to earlier. What is the Modi government doing? What do you think it's getting right? And where might it be off the mark?
Yeah. So the government is very interested in this domain. In fact, both the ministers of METI know a lot about chip design. So one of them has been a chip design engineer, so it's very rare for a minister to be a chip designer.
One of your tribe.
Yeah. So they do understand the fact. So what the difference between the version 2 and version 3 is, one, the government is putting a lot more upfront capital investment. So like I said earlier, the government did give subsidies, but they were in the form of reimbursement. So they said, you go and start a fab and we'll give you a PLI, production linked incentive kind of benefit. So no firm was interested because those 4 years that it takes to build, anything could happen. But this time the government is saying that we'll give you upfront capital support while you're building the fab. So that's like one big difference. The second big difference is the government is trying to play across the entire segments of the supply chain. So there are some policies for design, there are some policies for assembly, there are some policies for manufacturing, so on and so forth. So this kind of comprehensive strategy wasn't there earlier. Earlier it was just broken into different parts, and it wasn't integrated the way it is. So this is sort of things which are being done specifically, and there are many details to it, but I'm not going into them. The second part is, what are the general things done, right? Like I don't think semiconductor investment is very, very different from any large scale manufacturing setup. It's just that India is poor at many large scale manufacturing things, and so is the case with semiconductors. So there are a whole set of things you need to do to just improve the policy, tax, and trade environment. So that's what the GST is a big reform. I think in that sense it helps to have some predictability in the tax environment. The ease of doing business is also sort of improving, but that is also on the positive side. But where we have sort of gone back is on the trade environment. As you know, we have become more protectionist, and because this is a globalized semiconductor industry, with trade protectionism, you can't get this industry up, because you will need to do imports to do any exports. You need to import chips to do assembly and then send it back. So you need to have very good FTA arrangements, or you need to be a part of RCEP or TPP or any of these big formations, which India is not a part of. So that is one thing which we are lacking. So that's how I would characterize it. But from a priority, broadly from a semiconductor specific angle, I think they are in the right direction, but their priorities are a bit misplaced. For example, there's a lot of effort in trying to get this big, nice, flashy fab, which can be shown to the world that India has started its journey. But it will only achieve the goal of reducing our vulnerability to a small extent. Maybe you will need to do this over 20-30 years to get to somewhere where you have a geopolitical leverage. The geopolitical leverage can be achieved only through the design stage, where I already said India has a comparative advantage. So in my assessment, the priority should be a lot more on the design, to ensure that our human capital improves a lot, that the people across the world semiconductor design space are Indians, they are well trained, such that we can quickly go to the stage where Indian made chips with Indian intellectual property emerge fast. So right now it's not the most priority area, because design is not a flashy thing which can be projected. They are just some engineers sitting around a room and producing these files. But fabs are some things which all politicians across the world like. So there's a lot more focus on that.
So, Pranay, I want to ask you kind of two things, somewhat related, before we end this conversation, and they're both about the future. In thinking about kind of semiconductor geopolitics, what are some of the most important geopolitical trends on the horizon that are going to shape how this space pans out, right? I mean, obviously, we don't have a crystal ball. You don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen. But as you kind of enumerate, the top list of things that you would worry about or that would keep you up at night, what would they be?
Yeah, I think China-Taiwan relations is definitely one. From a geopolitical perspective, is something that I worry about, that will determine this. The other things are, how I see is, what is the strategic objective that nation states want to achieve through this instrument. So we call it silicon craft, in the sense that there are certain kinds of politico-economic instruments that you can use in this domain, and all of them depend on what is it that a nation state wants to achieve. So do they want to deny semiconductors to its adversary, or do they want to just outpace the adversary, or do they want to generally increase the supply chain resilience? So all of these are important factors which will determine where this goes. I fear that a lot of focus is on denial currently, and that denial is very difficult to achieve. And even if you try to achieve, there can be disproportionate breakthroughs in another domain, right? You're motivating your adversary to find alternative ways to get ahead. So maybe you can keep the adversary behind by a few years, but it will not achieve some big geopolitical goal in any case. So from that sense, I fear that there's a lot of focus on denial, and it's difficult to achieve denial in such a globalized environment. So that's what I would say.
So I want to end by asking you about one objective that gets talked a lot about, but you're skeptical of, as you just said, which is a sort of a decoupling of the semiconductor industry, right? I mean, whether it's the EU, the United States, India, eliminating one's foreign dependence in this area is kind of a non-starter, right? And one of the things you say at the very end of the book is that countries sooner or later will realize that, quote, semiconductor interdependence is a boon, not a bane, end quote. Tell us why you kind of leave readers with this final piece of wisdom.
Yeah. So I always say that, multilateralism in this domain is a necessity and not a choice. So it's not possible for even the US to make all its chips by its own. In fact, you would be surprised to know that Taiwan, which we talked about a lot, its biggest exports are chips, but its biggest imports are also chips. So there is no nation state which can do this on its own. You need to have this interdependence going. And in fact, US and China are also not decoupling in semiconductors. I always say that's why it's not a war, because they are trying to decouple only on the most advanced chips, the 5 nanometers and below. But all on the others, the business is as usual, because US companies can't survive without Chinese demand, and Chinese companies can't survive without accessing the US market either. So there is no decoupling happening on the semiconductor scale also. It's on one small advanced semiconductor side. So that's one. But because this has become so geopolitical and national security agenda, every nation state is putting massive subsidies to build its own domestic national champions, right? Now, the interesting part about this is that it is actually leading to removing the advantages that happened because of the comparative advantage based specialization, right? So just to give you an example, TSMC builds the same chip in Taiwan and also makes the same chip, let's say, in Arizona. The same chip would cost 40% higher in Arizona versus what it costs in Taiwan. So just imagine a US company. Why would it buy something from the Arizona plant when it can buy the same thing from Taiwan, right? The same company, but why would it? So the only way you can make that happen is when you have local sourcing mandates. So imagine a world where the US companies are told that for national security reasons, you must buy American and buy an American chip. So that we might go into that domain. Then to make things further tough, remember these fabs are the investment which I said $12 billion is not a one-time investment. If you want from 5 nanometers to transition to 3 nanometers, you need to put another $1 billion of investment. So all those kinds of things make it very difficult for governments to keep pumping money into a project when there is no economic logic happening, right? So because of this, I feel that nation states will realize that this semiconductor industry is a huge net positive for everyone. This should actually be in the domain of UN or something like that, where the semiconductor industry is a net positive for everyone in the world, and it is important to preserve its advantages as it exists today, given the globalization, instead of trying to do everything at home. So if nation states go down this path, the only way I see is they'll go into local sourcing mandates, repeated investment, and they'll realize that all of this doesn't get you anything, and it is much costly. And this semiconductor industry goes through cycles. We are seeing a huge, sort of euphoria because of the things that happened over the last 2-3 years, but you will see a downturn as well. And when that happens, all these logic will be tested severely. And I think that we have already hit the peak of semiconductor industry revenue, and over time we'll realize and hopefully go back to a world where interdependence works just fine with some adjustments so that we have better security built in, we have better ways to detect that if someone is trying to do espionage, etc. There are ways to do that without having to even think of decoupling.
So, Pranay, it was an excellent answer. Not a great answer if you want to boost sales of your books, because it would be much better if this race in crisis continues. You were on the show last year talking about your book, Missing in Action. You're on this year talking about your book, When the Chips Are Down. But you have a new book, another book coming out. Just give us your quick kind of elevator pitch. Tell us a little bit about what your new book is about.
Yeah, so our book is called We the Citizens, Strengthening the Indian Republic. It's by Khyati Pathak, Anupam Manur and me, and it's a graphic narrative on public policy, and we're trying to explain all the concepts that we talk about in public policy using a new format, and the aim is to reach to more people and more Indians specifically.
I just want to be very clear that I made the mistake before we started recording of calling this a children's book. And Pranay thankfully corrected me. This is not a children's book. It is a graphic narrative book. It is meant for people of all ages. But to help us understand some of these concepts, they have introduced graphics. It reminds me of the time when I met a friend of a friend who is worked in animation, and I called him what did I call him? I called him somebody who works on comic strips or something, and he got really upset. He said, "I'm an animator," and so I will try not to repeat this mistake again. My guest on the show this week is the scholar Pranay Kothasthane. He's the chair of high-tech geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution in Bangalore. And with Abhiram Munshi, he is the author of When the Chips Are Down, a deep dive into a global crisis. It's a terrific primer for anyone who is struggling to keep up with this race for chips that seems to be sweeping the world. Pranay, thank you so much for the book, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks for inviting me, Milan. Great to be. Thank you.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.